I'd like to welcome you all to this Cardonet client webinar on general data protection regulations. It's great to have so many of you tuning in. I'm going to take about 20 minutes of your time to talk through this agenda. I'm going to explain what the GDPR is, why it's relevant to you and your business, describe some of the key features of the regulation and how you go about achieving compliance, and then talk a little bit about how Cardonet can help. You can submit questions using that chat or question facility that you should be able to see on your screen. And you can also obviously get in touch with me afterwards if you do have questions that don't come up during the period of the webinar. I'll do my best to answer them either live or afterwards. So firstly, what is GDPR? This is a European Union regulation which creates and enforces personal data security obligations. It's relevant to any organisation in or out of the EU that processes EU citizens' data. So that means the UK after Brexit. GDPR comes into force in May 2018, and I think there are three main reasons why this regulation is coming into force. Firstly, this is about data security. It's a response to the growing cyber threat that exists. Secondly, it's about simplification. Currently, all 28 EU states interpret data regulation differently. So the GDPR is intended to simplify and remove the complexity across the EU. And then finally, it's about enforcement. What GDPR does is enforce those existing data regulations that exist in the 28 countries. So before I move on, I want to say that the one message that we have at Cardonet is, believe it or not, don't panic. I think there has been widespread hysteria about GDPR. But the fact is that it doesn't propose many significant changes from existing UK data protection legislation or from ISO 27001 requirements. So theoretically, UK businesses should be adhering to the majority of this regulation already. The key, though, is what I mentioned earlier, is the enforcement of that guidance, which is why I think business leaders are standing up and paying attention to this, because there's two really big reasons why you should care and why you must pay attention. The first one is revenue. Fines for non-compliance are up to a maximum of 4% of global revenue, or 20 million euros. Secondly, there's a reputational risk here, because any business that does have a data breach will be required to report that breach to anyone affected. So that includes your customers. And those breaches will be going into the public domain too, quite possibly on the Information Commissioner's website. So besides a willingness to use your customers and others' data ethically, there's two really significant reasons why you should care, and I think that's why people are paying attention to this incoming regulation. I'm now going to talk through some of the key features of general data protection regulation. This list isn't exhaustive, but I think that these are the things that businesses ought to be paying attention to right now, and it's worth knowing. And as the months go by, we can provide more detail about each of these. So as I said, GDPR is about personal data only. And for the large part, the definition of personal data remains unchanged. However, it does or will now include things like genetic, cultural, and economic or social information about an individual. And I think that's down to the fact that individuals are sharing that type of information on social media where it's being scraped for commercial purposes. Secondly, GDPR brings in two benefits for individuals, one of data portability and one of the right to be forgotten. Portability will allow individuals to obtain and reuse their personal data for their own purposes across different services. This means as a business you'll need to provide, free of charge, the personal data in a structured and commonly used format, an Excel spreadsheet for example. The right to be forgotten is fairly self-explanatory. But what that means in practice is that you'll need to have the processes and the technologies available to you to delete data in response to a right to be forgotten request. GDPR introduces this concept of continuous compliance. There's lots of buzzwords flying around, I think. Continuous compliance, you may have also heard the phrase data protection by design, or you may have heard talk of data protection impact assessments. Ultimately, what these phrases all amount to is the same thing, which is that you should be making data protection part of the DNA of your business, just like health and safety. I think it's a really useful analogy to consider data protection as important and as ingrained in your business processes as health and safety going forward. To quote Elizabeth Denham, who's the Information Commissioner, this is about moving away from a box-ticking mentality and building a culture of privacy. So I think the key thing to remember here as a business is that at any point you might be asked to demonstrate compliance, and if being compliant is part of your business's DNA, then that shouldn't be of too much concern. That said, one of the things that I think might be making data officers nervous right now is the fact that the window for reporting data breaches will be reduced to 72 hours. So if you do have a breach, you will need to report that to the supervisory authority within 3 working days. As I said, if you're practicing data protection by design and it's part of your business DNA, that shouldn't be too much of an issue. Fifth, there will be, in addition to the existing supervisory authority, the ICO, there will be an EU-wide enforcing body that sits over all of the EU states and as a supervisory authority. And then at business level, you may be obliged to appoint a data protection officer. So there will be 3 tiers of data protection authority, starting with your officer within your business, the country authority, which is the Information Commissioner for us, and then the EU-wide enforcing body. I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about the data protection officer, because I think this is very relevant for businesses, and probably the bigger change in terms of personnel that might need to happen. All public bodies will be obliged to appoint a data protection officer, and any business that's carrying out large-scale or systematic monitoring of individuals. Now, large-scale is defined as 5,000 or more data records, and monitoring of individuals can include, for example, online behaviour tracking. A data protection officer will be responsible for ensuring you're compliant, so that would mean regularly auditing and monitoring compliance, and for liaising with the supervisory authority if they make any requests, or in the case of having to report a breach. The good news is that a data protection officer doesn't need to be a dedicated role within your business, and you can appoint a data protection officer to act for a group of companies. A data protection officer doesn't need any special qualifications, but they must have the skills and experience to perform the role. So they must have a background in dealing with data and understand the law. And thirdly, more good news, you can actually outsource this role. So your responsibilities as a business are to ensure that your data protection officer reports to the highest level of management. You must also ensure that they're able to operate independently and couldn't be dismissed or penalised for doing their job. So this person must be above and free of influence. And then thirdly, you need to ensure that they've got adequate resources to meet their obligations. So that means they're going to need access to the places and the systems where personal data are stored, for example. Okay, so now I'm going to explain what you need to do to prepare for May 2018. We've divided this into 3 steps at Cardonet: preparation, governance, and responding. So first, how to prepare for May 2018. The first thing you need to do is bring the right people around the table within your business. This isn't just about IT. Your HR team, your marketing team, probably they hold personal data, and you need them to be working with you, with your data protection officer, so that you know what data you have, how it's used, who it's shared with. So that whole business approach is going to be really key to preparation. You should also be reviewing your current data protection policies and things like privacy and consent statements on your websites and on contracts. There's lots and lots of guidance and talk about consent and how that should be approached following GDPR. You need to start planning your response to those subject access or portability or right to be forgotten requests. These are things that you will need to have to demonstrate compliance. You will need to show that you have a business process in order to deal with them. And then you should also be reviewing your technical defences and identifying gaps. As I said, GDPR has been brought about because of the growing cyber threat. So responding to that will enable you to become more compliant. So from May 2018, you are going to need to ensure that compliance happens within your business as part of business as usual. And most of you, lots of businesses are likely to do that by appointing a data protection officer and then making sure that that person has the access and authority to do their job well. So they will be the person responsible for governing the GDPR within your business. But it's not just about them. You should also be educating all of your employees about good practice. That could be something that part of your data protection officer's role, to be regularly reminding and educating your teams. You should also be planning for regular security audits and continuous monitoring. Again, that would be something that a data protection officer would be planning for and advising you on. Okay, and then finally, responding, how you would respond in the case of a personal data breach. You should be have a disaster recovery plan in place for when that happens, and a plan that will both minimise the impact on the individuals whose data will be affected, and also on trying to ensure that it causes minimal disruption to your business. I think that that's one of the key points of a data impact assessment I mentioned at the start, is that you need to have a plan for mitigating for any kind of breach. Sorry about that. I said I'd mentioned how Cardonet can help. We can help at each phase. We can help at the preparation stage, at the governance phase, and we can help if you do need to respond. We can do an audit of your data security and those technical reviews. I mean, for many people will be doing that sort of thing already. We can operate as your data protection officer, the independent role within your business, and we can also help you to respond. We build disaster recovery plans for our clients that ensure business continuity, and if we are operating as a data protection officer for your business, then we would of course be responsible for liaising with the supervisory authorities. Okay, so I hope that's given you a good overview of where we are. I wanted to open up now to questions. If anyone has any questions that they'd like answered right now, Doesn't look like anything's come through during the webinar. In that case then, if you do have any questions, you're welcome to contact, obviously, your Cardonet main point of contact, or contact me by email. You should have my email from the webinar invitation. Oh, there we go. So we have a question from Ben, who's asked for an example of a disaster recovery plan that's specifically for a data breach. So is that I can't give you one of those live right now, but I can share something with you afterwards, if that's all right. Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. And so another question coming here. Ideas of timescale for the preparation stage. Well, if you take a look online, there are lots of people, as I said, who are being fairly hysterical about this and saying that we should have all started preparing in 2015. The reality is, the sooner the better. Depending on the size of your organisation, that understanding of where your data is, who's holding it, how it's used, how long you've held it, could take quite some time. If, as you'd hope, your business is very aware of where all this data is held, and you've got it in things like CRMs or HR systems or accounting systems, then the process will be much easier. But the gathering and understanding of the data is going to be probably the slowest piece of work, and the amount of time that take will vary depending on the size of your business. So I hope that's helpful. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening, everyone. As I said, feel free to ask any questions of me afterwards by email. And I hope that was useful. Thank you very much. Goodbye.